You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 23rd of October 2024 on Monocle Radio.
It's 4 a.m. in Sydney, 1900 in Paris, 1800 here in London and 1300 in Washington, D.C. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. Donald Trump finds room for the UK's Labour Party on his lengthy enemies list. Authoritative new survey finds dissatisfaction in France. Moves on to gauging Catholicism in Vatican. And how far would you go to retrieve a dropped phone? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Rainbow Murray and Vincent McAvaney will discuss today's big stories, and our On This Day historical series reflects on a key moment in the life of the spiritual godfather of today's wretched class of amoral demagogues. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller and I am joined today by Rainbow Murray, Professor of Politics, Queen Mary University of London, and Vincent McAvaney, journalist and Monocle Radio regular politics commentator. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Rainbow, as regular listeners, like there are any other kind, etc., may recall, last time you were with us, you were taking something of a leave of absence, but as part of that, you were going to watch, for reasons which I hope you will remind us of, the Olympics on time delay.
Yes, I had to have surgery and I've been recovering and unable to do other things. I have been availing myself of the opportunity to watch a whole bunch of Olympic sports I've never seen before. So I'm now much better informed about sports such as surfing, or BMX speed trials. I've watched some skateboarding, some artistic swimming. There's some really fascinating sports out there.
Did you have to go out of your way to avoid discovering any of the results, these games having concluded some while back?
I did my best. I don't like spoilers, but to be honest, after the third week of August, people had moved on and it became a lot easier.
Did you find yourself, because this often happens to me during every Olympic Games, I will find myself just getting weirdly mesmerised by something I had never cared about previously and generally never care about since. Sprint canoeing, I remember during the Rio Games getting massively into.
I watched sprint canoeing as well. It was fun.
It's great.
But it looks like something out of a theme park because they just sort of take your boat and then drop it almost off a cliff edge as the first thing that they do. And I looked at that and I thought, well, I wouldn't try this sport just for that. That looks terrifying.
And did you do that classic thing after about an hour of watching? You're just yelling at the TV, should have done the step out on the triple pike. He's really messed it up there. What an amateur move.
Yeah, you become the instant expert. It's great. I don't even know which sport you were gesturing at there, Vincent. Were you just
some form of gymnastics?
You were just saying sports words?
Yeah.
You have both been and are going to the United States, which is convenient because we're about to get into that.
Yeah, that's right. I was in California for 2 weeks. It was interesting. The election wasn't as prevalent as I thought it was going to be. I didn't see that many sort of bumper stickers or signs in the yards. But I am going back for election week for ITN. I'm going to Wisconsin, one of the 7 key swing states. And I've become fascinated by this place called Door County. This is my top tip for the election. Mm-hmm. If you look at a map of Wisconsin, it sort of looks like a fist, and the thumb at the very top, there's a county called Door County. And why it's so important, there are 7 key swing states. They break down into 520 counties, and only one of those counties has correctly predicted the election every time since the turn of the millennium. So it went Bush twice, Obama twice, it went Trump, and then it went Biden. It is the most purple state that you can find, and it's sort of known as Cape Cod on Lake Michigan. It's sort of mix of arable, and it's got people that have sort of moved up from the cities as well and sort of gentrified a bit. So it is the real bellwether.
And at any other time of year, that sounds downright pleasant.
That's right.
But we will start in the United States, which 2 weeks from today might have restored the power of life and death over us all to a convicted criminal publicly damned as a fraud and a menace by every broadly sane member of his previous administration and John Bolton. The nonsense story du jour is Donald Trump's campaign accusing the UK's governing Labour Party of election interference in the form of a few Labour Party staff spending their holidays indulging their West Wing fantasies assisting the campaign of Vice President Kamala Harris. This is, of course, completely different, for some reason, from Reform UK party leader Nigel Farage stomping for Trump when he should be getting potholes fixed in Clacton-on-Sea, which, if Nigel Farage is listening, is in Essex. Vincent, helpfully, you've done this. You have been one of the foreign agents of influence who has travelled furtively across the Atlantic to interfere in an American presidential election.
I have indeed done this. I worked for the Labour Party before I was a journalist in an MP and then she was Shadow Minister's office. And they facilitated this. It's gone back decades. I did this in 2012. The deal is you sort of pay your own way. We stayed in a hostel and we were sort of... All that happens is you're not paid to do this or anything. It's just the interface, because the campaigns, they have they have sort of sister parties around the world that are connected up. So the Labour Party is connected with other Labour parties across the world. They get together for conferences and they do this kind of thing, sharing of tactics and sometimes sharing of people as well.
It sounds like a massive, sinister global conspiracy.
Oh,
Vincent.
yeah, completely, yeah. But, it's what's interesting is you sort of turn up and it depends where you are in the US. We were in sort of Washington, D.C. and then in Maryland and Virginia. And they find you either really helpful or they want to hide you in the back office because they think the accent plays well in some places. And you actually find that when you're sort of knocking on doors, which is basically what you're doing, is you're sort of going out, door knocking, trying to get out the vote and helping with the sort of running of any big events that go on. And some people really are fascinated that you've come all this way and you're there wanting to talk to them, and you sort of particularly get into sort of geopolitical and why you think the foreign policy is good, and you have really interesting conversations, and you sort of hang the door knockers and do all that sort of stuff. So if you're sort of in a place where they think you'll be helpful, you go out and do that. If they think the accent might be a put off, you're actually in the offices sort of working on logistical operations and sort of getting out the vote on the day, which is the key thing. So it's not exactly nefarious. Both parties in this country do it. The Conservatives have done it historically with the Republicans as well. I think this is just an example of Donald Trump trying to cause sort of more doubt in the result of the election if it goes either way.
Well, on that thought, Rainbow, and apologies on your return to the show for putting you straight into the mind of Donald Trump, but is that what is going on here, that he's just reaching for anything he can that will help him a couple of weeks from now if he needs to cast doubt upon the result?
I think there's an element of that, and I think it's also a broader part of his sort of policy of post-truth politics. It's not necessarily when he gives out misinformation that he expects people to believe it. I think it's more that he hopes that if people no longer are able to distinguish between truth and lies, then people can't trust anything. And so then if people come along and say, well, there was this type of electoral fraud. I mean, in Donald Trump's previous election, there were insinuations that he'd had help from Putin. I'm not necessarily saying that was the case, but it's useful to make sure that no one really knows what the truth is, no one really trusts anything or anyone, because in that situation of chaos, it's easier for Trump to get away with some of the most outrageous things that he's done and some of the more questionable policies that he wants to implement.
Vincent, there has been, not just in the wake of this story, but gathering over previous weeks as the polls have tightened, an amount of fretting in British media about what the British are fond of calling the special relationship. Obviously, last time Donald Trump was president, the Tories were, well, in charge seems like the wrong phrase, but they were broadly in government in the United Kingdom. And as you've suggested, that is perhaps a more natural fit than between the Republican Party and the Labour Party. If we do know one thing about Donald Trump is that he is a grudge bearer of, frankly, Olympian scale. Is this potentially going to be a problem should he get re-elected?
I think it could be, but Donald Trump has a problem with people of all political stripes, because actually when the Conservatives were in power and he in his time in office, he wasn't particularly helpful to Theresa May, who was in the first part of his presidency, because he made things very awkward for her. He didn't respect her. He in fact said to her, "Why are you Prime Minister and not Boris Johnson? You should, Boris Johnson should be promoted. He should be sort of leading." And it was very awkward for Theresa May. And I think she is someone who tries to carry a bit of grace as a former Prime Minister, because we've had so many problems with now our ex-Prime Ministers like Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. But even she has come out and been quite critical of Donald Trump over the years. And he is definitely going to remember this. He has met with Keir Starmer, who was over in New York for the UNGA conference last month, and he had dinner with Donald Trump in New York as a way of trying to future-proof in case he does come in, to try and build some kind of personal relationship. I think as good as that meeting might have been for Keir Starmer, Donald Trump will have had Nigel Farage whispering in his ear, heavily criticising Keir Starmer and filling Donald Trump's sort of mind with the idea that he's a sort of far leftist, he's a deep socialist, all these kinds of things. So I think Donald Trump will be aware of this, but it is being pointed out, and whether or not he'll take any notice, even by Republicans, that this is normal. Conservatives in this country have gone out, members of the Conservative Party support their party. In fact, I'm quite sure there are probably some of them out there in the US doing that right now, and Labour have always gone out and supported the Democrats.
Rainbow, as I was saying, it is a little less now than 2 weeks until election day, but Europe, where we are sitting, has had 4 years to get used to the idea, or acclimatise itself to the idea that Donald Trump may be returned to office. Do you get the sense that Europe has actually done enough to prepare itself for that eventuality, and in particular the nightmare scenarios attached to it, which is that Trump yanks the plug on Ukraine, possibly yanks the plug on NATO, and effectively leaves Europe to look after itself?
It's a difficult situation. I mean, of course, Europe's already had 4 years of Trump, but the world has changed a great deal in those 4 years. As you rightly point out, there's the conflict in Ukraine, and so there's the tensions with Russia. Things are also kicking off quite heavily in the Middle East. And the US has been very involved in that conflict as well. And one thing that we know about Donald Trump is he's quite insular and isolationist. He doesn't want to be the world's peacekeeper. He's very much America first. So Europe needs to figure out where it's going to sit in the world as a sort of independent unit without the US as a potential ally in some of these quite serious global conflicts. And within that, you've also got to bear in mind that not everybody in Europe agrees with everybody else. We can't think about Europe
famously.
Yes. Europe is not a homogenous entity. So we're seeing, rather than seeing a sort of European-wide agreement being brokered, we're seeing a number of bilateral agreements between countries that are able to see eye to eye. So it is going to be challenging, I think, without a doubt, if Trump comes back in.
Well, to Israel now, the capacities of whose intelligence services have been amply demonstrated in recent weeks, between outfitting Hezbollah's officer class with exploding pages and whacking Hamas's political chief in the heart of Tehran. Arguably unsurprisingly, it now appears that Israel has itself been the target of similar endeavours. Israeli police and the Shin Bet, Israel's domestic intelligence service, claim to have rolled up a network of Israeli citizens which has spent the last couple of years collecting information for Iran. They are reportedly Jewish immigrants to Israel from Azerbaijan. Vincent, first of all, with not just this story, but pretty much all stories of this sort, I'm torn between thinking, wow, this is really weird, and thinking also it would be a lot weirder if this wasn't happening.
Yeah, I think we've seen this in multiple nations. In recent years, we've had a number of people here in the UK, for instance, arrested and under investigation for doing the same kind of things, allegedly for Russia. There was an attempt in the last 18 months to sort of blow up a storehouse for provisions that was heading to Ukraine just outside of London. So I think we are very much back in, and what's really fascinating is even this month you've had the head of the UK's intelligence services coming out and saying this is going on. There are Russian agents in the UK and across Europe who are doing everything possible to try in this sort of asymmetrical warfare to subvert our societies, to cause disruption, to cause confusion, subterfuge, to do all of this. And it is a little bit Cold War era like, but perhaps we were all lulled into believing this sort of stuff never really went away, when really it never went away.
Another aspect of these stories, or this story and others like it, Rainbow, which bewilders me somewhat, is that they tend to put me back in the office of whichever functionary of the Mukhabarat it was in Syria whose job it was to yell at visiting journalists. And the last time I was in Syria, which I think was about ages ago, 2007, 2008 or something, I was on the receiving end of this lecture. Me and the photographer I was with were being given the big list of what we could and could not take pictures of, angles from which we couldn't take pictures of various buildings. And the chap did seem to have enough of a sense of humour that I did feel able to ask him, what do you think me and my colleague are going to be able to find out that the Israeli Air Force doesn't know already? At which point he just sort of shrugged and said, look, I have a job to do here. But this is what I wonder. What can we now find out, really, that we can't find out by sitting at home with our feet up and firing up Google Earth? About the bases and stuff that, that these people are accused of spying on.
There's clearly a lot of behaviour that you can't get from a Google search, and I think that's perhaps what sort of shocked people in this story, that it was a sort of betrayal on the inside. It was people who might have been assumed to be loyal to their country, engaging in acts of high treason. But if there's anything that we know about people, it's that they have dissenting views. We can't assume that just because someone is Jewish and Israeli, they are therefore loyal to the State of Israel. And we also know that people will do anything for money. And these people were being bribed. They were being offered large sums. And so I think in the same way that people get shocked when they find out that their neighbours have been, keeping someone in the basement for decades or whatever, you never truly know people, and until the Israeli intelligence services tell you otherwise.
I'm also fascinated, Vincent, by the conversations that must go on when you do roll up a spy ring that has been, so the Israeli authorities saying, collecting information on your military installations for 2 years. There must be surely a temptation just to go, well, we'll keep that quiet.
Absolutely. But I suppose there is a benefit in putting it out there, in that you have, one, scored a slight victory by detecting them, and perhaps you might have actually monitored them for some time before you sort of move in on them so you can fully identify their network. It makes people aware that these kind of operations are going on, and perhaps if you do work in sensitive areas, in militaries or, in other sort of cutting-edge science or anything like that, that you should be aware that these kind of operations are taking place. We have seen a number of these kind of spy swaps, these sort of deep-place spy swaps over the years. And it does remind, even as journalists, we are briefed at times to be very careful of people suddenly sort of trying to make contact with you or trying to sort of cozy up to you, particularly from certain nations or that you think might be from certain backgrounds, and to be cautious of that. It can be online or in real life. And it is something that we have seen in plenty of countries now around the world. There was that huge spy swap back in the 2000s with Americans and Russia. They were, you had these people living so deeply undercover that sometimes their own children don't even know what their parents are doing and where they're actually from.
Well, let's look at France now, a nation proverbial for its tradition of discontent. Indeed, the French rarely seem happier, ironically, than when flinging café furniture at the gendarmes over the sort of minor reform to council taxes which in more temperate polities might just about occasion a couple of miffed letters to the local paper. As such, it is difficult to describe as news the revelation that a majority of French folk believe that their current system does not work, but the results of a survey by the Economic, Social and Environmental Environmental Council, which advises the government, are bracing reading. They find that most people believe the Fifth Republic is dysfunctional, and here's the fun part, that a narrow majority believe that only strong power can guarantee law and order. Rainbow, unsurprisingly, this came up quite a lot during Monocle Radio's Olympic period sojourn in Paris, when Parisians were having to adjust to the fact that the Olympic Games they had spent years dreading the prospect of were actually going really tremendously well, and everyone was having a really nice time. Do the French actually, do you think, believe that their country is a hopeless, dysfunctional mess that they are cursed to have to live in, or do they just kind of enjoy pretending that it is?
I think there is actually some genuine discontent. There's been a lot of ill feeling since the snap parliamentary election earlier this year, which produced a hung parliament. But it was kind of fairly evenly divided between three main players, the left, the centre and the far right. And of those three, the Left Alliance had the largest number of seats, so they expected to form a government. But in the end, Macron formed a government with a prime minister from the right-wing party who secured under 5% of the vote. And so a lot of people came away from that thinking, well, what did we vote for? If we choose one party and we get a government of another, is that still even a democracy? This is completely dysfunctional. But I thought what was most striking from this survey, what really stuck with me, was that 23% of people, that's almost a quarter of the population, thought that a non-democratic alternative might be the best option. That worried me. It's one thing to say, our democratic system is imperfect and we need to change it. It's quite another to say, well, let's give authoritarianism a try.
That and other aspects of this survey, Vincent, are presumably going down rather well at Chez Le Pen.
Yes, very much so. And I think, just to pick up on that last point, that stat I think really struck me. I was trying to see a breakdown of age group, but I couldn't find one, because I think it's really fascinating. There have been some studies recently that particularly younger generations, Gen Z, aren't that sort of enamoured by democracy globally. And we've seen that trend kind of across the world. And you do think that is pretty alarming. We are in this sort of biggest year for democracy with all these elections taking on around the world. But yeah, Marine Le Pen must be pretty happy that, you know, this thing that Macron did, which at the time seemed wild, and as time has gone on seems even more inexplicable, because they had this sort of summer of deadlock and now they're sort of heading into a winter of discontent where no one is happy with what's going on. It seems like the country is pretty paralysed. And for Marine Le Pen facing that next election, she could come in on a momentum. And it'll be interesting to see as well if Donald Trump gets in the United States, whether she sort of capitalises on that sort of resurgent wave of the sort of alt-right, populist right around the world, and people think that, well, let's give this a go in France, much like we sort of pushed the button on Brexit in the UK. If this is your biggest chance in your life to upset the apple cart because you think, hey, society isn't working for me anyway, so let's see what happens when I really shake things up, it could be quite a time of transition for France, because she could have the authority to really change things and move in quite interesting ways.
I mean, is it beyond the realm of imagining, Rainbow, that the French might upend their order again? I mean, the very phrase Fifth Republic suggests that they do have an amount of form for that kind of thing.
They do have an amount of form. The Republic started getting numbered with the French Revolution in the late 18th century, and we've had the Fifth Republic since 1958, so it's been almost 70 years, and there's been a lot of clamour for change across those nearly 70 years to institute a Sixth Republic. The Fifth Republic was designed to fix all the flaws of the Fourth Republic, but the real question is, if not the current system, then what? Because does the current system work very well anymore? No. Is there a better alternative? That's a lot less certain. So before they overthrow their whole system, they need to come up with some viable alternative. But it's not just the far right who want rid of the Fifth Republic, it's also the far left. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the far left presidential candidate who always polls quite well, has been quite open in wanting to get rid of the Fifth Republic. And he has quite a young electorate, to go back on what you were saying, Vinny. So there is a section of the population that has seen in recent years, as France has moved away from a classic sort of left-right opposition towards a much more divided policy, they've seen that the current system is not really able to represent their views, but they haven't yet managed to coalesce around any alternative.
But just finally on this, Rainbow, has anybody tried, or would any prominent politician, that is, has anybody tried, or would they have any luck if they did, trying to point out to the French, look around you. This is objectively a nicer country than almost any other now or at any point in human history. Almost everybody who has ever lived would trade places with you.
I don't think people were interested in relative happiness in France. I think they're simply... are things as perfect as I want them to be? No. Right, let's complain. And the French do have a very well-established tradition of protest and being disgruntled. But they do have some legitimate grievance, I think, at the moment, in the sense that the political system has failed to deliver a strong and stable government. It's failed to deliver one that translates voter preferences into outcomes. So I think that there is some work that needs to be done there. And the government has already indicated that it might be interested in looking at a more proportional electoral system. So I think they've heard the discontent and are becoming open to a different way of doing things. But that's not quite the same as getting rid of the Fifth Republic altogether and trying authoritarianism, even though people have accused Macron of being a bit of an authoritarian. And so it seems to be strange that they would want to replace something that they think is bad with something that's objectively worse.
Well, to Australia and to what seems like something of a parable for our tech-dependent age. A young woman by the unimprovably Australian name of Matilda Campbell was hiking in the Hunter Valley region of New South Wales, a perfectly reasonable thing to do, it's lovely up there, when she dropped her phone. The device fell into a crevice between two boulders. Attempting to retrieve it, Ms. Campbell slipped, fell headlong between the rocks and was wedged upside down for 7 hours before bemused rescue workers retrieved her, mercifully unharmed and apparently unfazed. The phone is reportedly lost to the bush. Vincent, I come to this story as somebody who I think my honest response on dropping my phone somewhere I couldn't recover it would be one of more unalloyed relief than actual anguish. Have you ever gone to untoward length to retrieve a phone? Have you hopped onto a tube track or anything?
No, I've not done that. I mean, you say that, but I recently had an incident that's pretty prevalent in London at the moment where you've got these sort of e-bike riders coming along and trying to snatch your phone. Mm-hmm. This person tried to do this when I was walking along Oxford Street. Luckily, then he sort of managed to slap it out of my hand. They didn't manage to grab it, and I sort of grabbed the phone and yelled at the guy as he sped off. And I've seen it multiple times now on the streets of London. It is sadly quite common. But what I did realise was I immediately thought, if he'd got it, do I know how to immediately deactivate it? And that's taught me, actually, because I thought all the things that I've got in there, you know, the apps that give you access, and yes, there is controls in the phone, but there's still a lot of data in there that you never know they could potentially get at. And it has taught me, like, I need to, you know, when you think about all the, you know, and all the backups that you need to make sure that are safe as well for the photos and everything else, I did think, I need to learn quickly how to make sure I know immediately, and you can do it via your Apple Watch, you can do it via your the MacBook, to immediately turn it off, but also make it unusable. So even though they've got it, there are ways that it completely becomes a dummy phone, as it were. It's something that I think everyone should probably take a look at these days, because if you do lose your device, you want to make sure that as soon as you get a new one, everything is there for you.
I simply avoid any such worries by barely having any information or apps on my phone at all. There are benefits to being a Luddite. Rainbow, if you dropped your phone into somewhere where really only an echidna is going to be able to access it, and possibly, I don't know what the chances are of it guessing your PIN by prodding the screen with its beak. I know echidnas don't technically have a beak. I'm not really sure what the word for a elongated proboscis is. Would you climb headlong between two boulders trying to get it back?
I probably wouldn't. But I do think that phones are more than their material worth. It's partly about the private information, but if, as you say, it's just lost to the wilderness. There's also, I think, a sentimental attachment. I'm quite attached to the phone that I have. It was given to me by my dad, who's since passed away. So, I won't upgrade it, even though it desperately needs it, because it's the phone my dad gave me. But there's also a fact that we have become, as a society, very dependent on our smartphones. Even if you could buy a new one tomorrow, that means you have to wait all the time until tomorrow, during which time people can't reach you. You're not able to access the internet.
God, that sounds amazing.
I know, but people get FOMO. People worry about what they're going to do without having that communication and that information at their fingertips. And so you now hear about people sort of being trained to detox from their phones for short periods of time, and they are addictive things. People find it very stressful and anxiety-inducing to have their phones taken away from them for even a few hours. There was experiments done with teenagers because there were concerns about the harmful effects of smartphones on the developing teenage psyche, and taking their phones away from them for even a few hours was really anxiety-inducing. So whilst I could probably manage if I dropped my phone down a crevice, I can understand why some people might risk life and limb trying to get it back.
Have you, Vincent, I want to ask you each of this in turn, if not phones, have you ever yourself or known of somebody to have gone to particularly untoward lengths to retrieve a thing? I'm thinking many years ago, in the pre-mobile phone age, of somewhere in Washington State in the US, me and the photographer I was with stopped to take a photo of a road sign, which amused us for reasons which are not germane to this anecdote. We realised when we were approaching the festival we had gone to cover that he had dropped his light meter in the grass, and by that time we are halfway across Washington State, sailing on a ferry across Bremerton Sound, as I recall, when he realised it was missing. He drove back once we had concluded our assignment to the road sign somewhere just south of the Canadian border, trying to find his light meter, and unsurprisingly did not.
My one bad experience of losing something like this was I went to a wedding with some cousins. We drove there in the hire car, as I remember, and the plan was to go back and get the hire car the next day with the second hire car that we had. It was about an hour from the house we were staying in to where my cousin's wedding was. I parked the car, took the car key with me, but left the key to the accommodation in the car.
Amazing.
We then left the wedding, got home to the accommodation. I realised that we had left the house key at the wedding venue. I had to run back after the taxi man.
You must have been popular.
Get back. I mean, it was not great. Luckily, it was a very nice evening. We're in the south of France. Everyone just sat out. Also, I furiously went and got this key. That was the worst. But the funniest one I've ever seen, actually, was a colleague in the 2019 general election was interviewing then Prime Minister Boris Johnson and was trying to quote something to him from his phone live on air, when Boris Johnson simply grabbed the phone, slipped it in his pocket.
That was a colleague of yours.
And then walked away, and that person had to harass Downing Street operatives for the Prime Minister to give him his phone back because he'd walked off with it.
I remember that footage vividly. That is a hard one to cap. Rainbow, have you or has anybody you know ever gone to what are possibly extreme lengths to retrieve a material object?
Someone who shall remain nameless told me that they'd put their hands down a portaloo to try and retrieve their mobile phone, and that's a length I wouldn't go to. Let's leave it there.
Yes, I think that is exactly what we're going to do. Rainbow Murray and Vincent McAvaney, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, our On This Day historical series identifies the one politician who wrote the playbook for the modern shameless populist. Shamelessness is obviously a reprehensible character defect. We all do say or think things of which we should not be proud, and we all should subsequently reflect on why we did, said, or thought whatever the heck that was, and do our best not to do, say, or think it again in future. Herewith concludes today's sermon. But shamelessness is also kind of a superpower. If you simply do not care about laws, norms, conventions, notions of decency, propriety or courtesy, that kind of stuff, you can be pretty hard to stop. It is, regrettably, especially the case in politics. In an age benighted, as ours is, by flagrant and irrepressible populist demagogues, it is not difficult to name amoral maniacs who have just kept on getting away with it. Berlusconi, Trump, Johnson, Bolsonaro, Orban, Duterte, Maduro, Zuma, Wilders, etc., and dismally, etc.
I did everything right and they indicted me.
It is arguable, however, that a somewhat less familiar name is the grandfather and or godfather of them all, and in a lifetime of getting away with it, Charles J. Haughey got away with it in especially literal fashion on October 23rd, 1970.
And we're all off to Dublin in the green,
It had become known in Ireland as the arms crisis. In May 1970, the Taoiseach, Jack Lynch, had sensationally sacked his finance minister, Charles Haughey, and his agriculture minister, Neil Blaney. The pair had been asked to oversee a fund established by the Irish government to assist nationalist communities in Northern Ireland suffering the early upheavals of what would become known as the Troubles. Irish police had discovered that a decent chunk of that money had instead been used to buy weapons for the nascent provisional IRA. Charges against Blaney were dropped, and on this day 54 years ago, Haughey's trial ended in acquittal. If Haughey had suspected by this point that the way to overcome criticism or even prosecution for scandalous or even criminal behaviour was simply to ignore it, swagger on with a wave to the crowd and a wink to the press, the arms crisis proved it. He was compelled to languish a while on the backbenches, but he was a minister again within a few years, Taoiseach himself inside a decade. This is the actual jingle with which Haughey and his party, Fianna Fáil, sought and won re-election in 1981. We'll rise and follow Charlie. Haughey was, in many respects, not a bad Taoiseach. He deserves much credit for Ireland's economic transformation during the 1980s. But he was a bad man, whose breezy charm barely concealed a relish for intimidation, and much more to the point of our lesson, he was an absolutely astonishing crook. Charlie's song will sing as one. In 2011, 5 years after Haughey's death at age 80, a tribunal of inquiry into his finances, not the first, concluded that between 1979 and 1992, a period during which Haughey was either Taoiseach or leader of the opposition, he had trousered something in the region of 45 million euros in bungs from various sources.
After he stepped down, the mystery of how he acquired his wealth began to unravel. A succession of tribunals produced dramatic revelations of how his opulent lifestyle was supported by huge personal donations from prominent businessmen and financial institutions. Also uncovered were secret Haughey accounts involving more millions in offshore locations.
He had also stolen prodigiously from his own party's campaign funds and from donations to a fundraiser he'd established to pay for a liver transplant for an old friend. Charlie's song will sing as one. Monstrous though Haughey's larceny looked when laid out in forensic detail, arguably the most shocking aspect of it was that nobody was really all that shocked. Haughey had never troubled to hide the fact that he enjoyed a lifestyle difficult to reconcile with the public sector wages of a career politician from a modest background. It had been common knowledge that Haughey owned a handsome Georgian country house on a 100-hectare estate outside Dublin, a stud farm in County Meath, and a private island in the Blaskets off County Kerry, accessible only by his 16-metre yacht, the Celtic Mist, or helicopter. Similarly, it was widely and correctly supposed that the mysterious paramour that gossip columnist Terry Keane coyly referred to in her columns for 27 years as Sweetie was Charles Haughey. But Haughey was, as such scoundrels always are, unembarrassable to the very end.
This is not the time to outline any special list of claims or achievements. Let the record speak for itself. If I were to seek any accolade as I leave office, it would simply be he served the people, all the people, to the best of his ability.
Haughey left to subsequent charlatans an example of what ironclad shamelessness can accomplish. To the rest of us, he left a definition of the term. It is the quality required to gaze face entirely straight into a camera and tell your nation this, as Charles Haughey did in 1980, shortly after becoming leader of the country he spent his life looting.
As a community, we are living way beyond our means.
And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Rainbow Murray and Vincent McAvenny. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Sana Jamani. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.